What's one truth you wish you'd said out loud when you were younger?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? The only time my family ever moved fast was when the bill had my sister's name on it. When it had my son's name, I was told to pray, to be patient, and to stop asking for what they said they could not give. That line alone should tell you exactly how upside down this whole story is. When my son got sick, the kind of sick that turns your whole world into a rotating cycle of specialists, insurance denials, and half-hour calls to billing departments, I did what any parent would do. I begged. I asked for help. I looked my parents in the eye, the same people who raised me, and I told them their grandson needed a treatment that insurance was refusing to cover. I had already maxed out my credit card on copays and lab work. I had already sold my car and taken a medical credit line with interest rates that would make anyone's stomach churn. All I asked for was a bridge, something to help me get through the gap until I could figure out how to pay the rest. My parents sat me down and explained how tight things were. They said the cost of living had gone up, their retirement accounts were down, and they simply could not help. They made it sound like they were just barely hanging on, and I believed them. I remember sitting in my kitchen after that talk, feeling like the walls were pressing in on me, but I told myself, maybe they really can't. Maybe it's not that they don't want to, maybe they just can't. I convinced myself of that lie because the alternative was too painful to consider. I did what I had to. I worked extra shifts, I asked friends for help, I opened another line of credit that I had no business opening. I did all of it because I had no other choice. And still, it wasn't enough. My son died. I don't want to linger there, because I can't, but I'll say this. You don't just lose a child, you lose your footing in the world. Everything tilts. People speak to you differently. Food tastes like cardboard. You go through the motions, but there's nothing under them. Months later, I was trying to distract myself with paperwork. Canceling accounts. Closing out things that no longer had a reason to exist. That's when it happened. I was at my desk one morning, scrolling through emails, when one popped up from my sister's building. It wasn't even meant for me. She must have listed me as a backup contact at some point. It was a lease renewal form, and I would have deleted it without thinking, except my eyes caught on a line halfway down the page. It listed the guarantor for the lease, the Pierce Family Trust. My grandparents' trust. The same one I vaguely remembered from when I was younger, the one that was supposed to exist for education and emergencies. I froze. I opened the PDF again and read every line. The renewal wasn't just guaranteed by the trust, the payment instructions showed monthly wires coming directly from its bank account. I sat there staring at the page because it was so obvious, so blunt, so undeniable. Every month, thousands of dollars were being wired out of a fund that was supposed to help all of us when life hit hard. My parents had told me they were tapped out, but they had been sending money to keep Brittany in a luxury apartment with a rooftop pool and a concierge. I couldn't even move for a while. I thought maybe I was misreading. I thought maybe the trust was bigger than I realized, maybe it could support both. But the more I read, the more I saw how deliberate it was. The guarantor field wasn't an accident. Someone had signed that paper. Someone had given the routing number. Someone had approved it every single month. I pulled out my phone and scrolled back through my texts. There it was, plain as day. Me, asking my mom if they had anything, even a loan, anything to get Ethan into the program the doctor recommended. Her reply, "We wish we could help, honey, but we just can't right now. Try church." That was the exact text. Try church. And all the while, she was logging into the trust account, authorizing a wire to cover Brittany's rent. My chest hurt so bad I thought I was going to faint, but after the shock settled, something else came in. A cold, steady clarity. For the first time since my son died, I felt like my brain clicked back on. I printed the lease form, I printed the email, I printed my text messages. I slid them into a folder. I sat at my table until it got dark, just reading them over and over, letting the truth sink in. And here's the part that changed everything. I didn't run to confront them. I didn't scream. I didn't write an angry email. I knew if I went in hot, they would just deny, deflect, and somehow make me look ungrateful or hysterical. So I did something I had never done before. I called an attorney. Her name was Dana. She specialized in trusts and estates, and when I told her what I had, she didn't sound surprised. She said this kind of thing happens more than people realize, especially when families think no one will ever question them. She told me to keep everything, to make copies, to stop discussing money with my parents altogether. Then she said the line that made me feel like, for the first time in years, someone was actually on my side. We'll ask for an accounting, and if they stall, we file. That was the moment I knew this wasn't going to stay a secret. I wasn't going to let them rewrite history and pretend they did their best. I was going to pull every wire, every statement, every lie into the light, and I was going to make them answer for it. And I hadn't even told them I knew yet. I woke up the next morning with that folder on the table staring at me like a dare. And while the old version of me would have called my mother before breakfast and begged for a reasonable explanation that would only leave me confused and apologizing for asking the question the wrong way, the version of me that had sat with Dana on the phone for almost an hour decided that explanations could wait until the documents spoke first, because documents do not raise their voice, they do not cry, they do not accuse, they just sit there and prove what they are designed to prove. Before I made a single move, I tested the water in a way that looked small from the outside, but meant everything to me on the inside, because I needed to confirm that I was not imagining the patterns that had been running my family like a quiet operating system since we were kids, over coffee with my mother at a chain place she likes for the predictable menu and the predictable crowd. I mentioned my sister's building in the most casual tone I could manage and asked whether the trust had any role in helping Brittany during her last lease renewal, and the way my mother's face smoothed itself into polite blankness so quickly that it almost squeaked told me more than any sentence she could have said. She changed the subject with the skill of a person who has practiced for decades, jumped to a neighbor's surgery, to the price of groceries, to the pastor's new series. And when I gently steered back and asked how an emergency and education fund became a private concierge for downtown living, she set her cup down very carefully and told me I was being unkind, that I did not understand how fragile Brittany had been during a difficult stretch at work, and that the apartment kept her stable, which was one of those words that sounds neutral, but in our family always meant we did something expensive for your sister and need you to accept it without questions. I sat there and felt the familiar guilt try to climb into my throat, the reflex that tells you to be the bigger person and let it go, but I pushed it back down and asked a single clear question that did not leave room for a story. When I asked for help with my son's treatment and you told me you could not contribute a single dollar, were you sending monthly wires to Brittany's landlord from the trust, yes or no? And before she could form a sentence, the silence answered for her because a person who has the moral high ground does not need to find a better angle, they just say the word. I did not argue, I did not accuse, and I did not cry, because I had promised myself that feelings would not drive this car anymore, and when she tried to end the conversation with a soft reprimand about tone and timing, I stood, hugged her shoulder, said I loved her, and went home to my laptop, where I opened a blank document and started writing the letter Dana had outlined with that calm voice that makes you feel like the floor has stopped moving. In the letter, I identified myself as a beneficiary of the Pierce Family Trust, referenced the clause that allows a beneficiary to request a full accounting, and asked for statements, ledgers, and purpose codes for all disbursements over the last 5 years, which covered the period before my son got sick and extended to the present, not because I wanted to drown in history, but because I wanted to show the pattern cleanly, and I gave a reasonable deadline in plain language, which matters more than people think, since a reasonable deadline makes unreasonable behavior stand out like a siren. I attached a second paragraph that stopped disbursements for non-essential items until the accounting was complete, because once you see the leak, you do not wait for the next drip to hit the floor. You shut the valve and then count the damage, and before I hit send, I added a line that felt like stepping through a doorway I had been staring at all my life. I CC'd Brittany, not to shame her, not to pull her into a fight that should have been handled by the trustees, but to remove the comfortable fog that lets adults say they did not know, because if you benefit from a thing, you should at least be capable of reading the page that paid for it. I pressed send and felt the kind of quiet that comes after you finally do the thing you have dreaded, the kind that is not peace yet, but is at least the absence of scrambling. And then I started gathering the simple proof that lives in phones and inboxes and online portals, because while my family speaks fluently in impressions, courts speak in evidence. So I exported my text thread with my mother from the month when I begged for help, saved the voicemail where she told me to try church, downloaded the insurance denials that spelled out coverage gaps in perfect bureaucratic English, and took screenshots of the renewal notice that named the trust as guarantor, because if anyone tried to say that I misunderstood, the pages would speak again. And they would say, "Here is what happened, and here is when." 2 days passed in that strange waiting state where you are hyper-aware of your phone yet pretending to be normal at work, and then a group message popped up with my mother's name stamped across the top. The kind of family text she uses to pull us into line without making it sound like an order, and it said that we should all meet for dinner on Sunday, that she loved us both, that we needed to talk like adults and put this unpleasantness behind us, which made me laugh out loud alone at my desk. Because the speed with which unpleasantness arrives when the money stops is almost a law of physics in families like mine. I replied that I could make Sunday, and then I called Dana, because while dinner sounded like a social event, I had learned enough in a very short time to treat it like a negotiation with appetizers. And she walked me through exactly what to bring and exactly what not to say, reminded me that I was not obligated to accept any emotional framing that erased the facts, and suggested I print 2 neat sets of everything so that no one could claim they had not seen the documents clearly. Brittany texted separately an hour later, a breezy message about how I must be stressed, and how Mom sometimes overreacts, and how the trust was complicated and not worth making a scene over, which told me she felt the freeze already and was running a familiar play where she comforts just enough to avoid accountability, and I did not take the bait. I told her I was looking forward to Sunday, that transparency helps everyone, that I had copies to make the conversation simple, and I left it there, because I was done with essays designed to be misunderstood on purpose. On Sunday afternoon, as I slid the binders into my bag and checked that the court notice of our petition draft was printed on clean paper with my case header precisely where it needed to be, my father called with that soft tone he reserves for moments when Mom's plan needs a gentler messenger, and he said we could settle this privately without lawyers, that they would make it right, that I should show a little grace and think of the family's peace. And I told him I loved him, that privacy was available to people who told the truth on paper, and that peace without honesty was just another word for silence, which I had already done for too many years. I zipped the bag, looked at the clock, and felt a steadiness I had not felt since before my son got sick, because whatever happened in that private room, I would not be alone with a feeling. I would be a woman with records and a plan. And there's a difference you can feel in your bones. When the restaurant called to confirm the reservation for a private room and offered to set the table with a little candlelight, I almost laughed again, because nothing about this needed decoration, so I asked for water, decent chairs, and a door that closed. And as I drove over, my phone lit up with a final text from my mother that read, "Let's keep this in the family, okay?" Which, after everything, landed like an emblem on the whole history of our house, a little ribbon on a box that held a secret, and I walked in ready to untie it. When I arrived at the attorney's office the following week, the weight of what I carried in my bag felt almost physical, not because the folder was heavy, but because the story inside it had been buried under silence for so many years. And now it was beginning to take a shape that could not be dismissed as a daughter's bitterness or a grieving mother's inability to move on. Dana welcomed me with the same steady calm that had made me choose her in the first place, and as I laid out the documents, she explained, in that precise but conversational tone, that my rights as a beneficiary were not a matter of sentiment or family tradition but of law, and that once the written request had been sent and ignored, the next step was not argument but a filing. She drafted the petition for a formal accounting with a thoroughness that almost startled me, listing dates, attaching exhibits, and citing statutes I had never heard of but now felt like lifelines, because each line reminded me that my parents' version of events was not the only one that mattered. When the response from my parents finally arrived, It was laughable in its thinness, a single-page summary that looked like it had been typed in a rush, filled with vague lines labeled support and miscellaneous disbursements, with not a single statement or receipt attached, as though they truly believed that I would be too intimidated to press further. But the summary was useful in its own way, because it proved that they understood the request and had chosen to dodge it, and that choice gave Dana all the justification she needed to file for a temporary freeze on the trust's non-essential disbursements. Within a week, a judge granted the order, and with the stroke of a pen, the stream of money that had kept Brittany's apartment secured came to a halt. The effect was immediate. The building's management office, which had been content for years to receive its wires without question, sent Brittany a polite but firm message asking for updated payment instructions, and that email, which she forwarded to my parents with panicked capital letters, landed in my inbox as part of the discovery process, becoming the first third-party confirmation that the trust had been paying her bills all along. It was the kind of proof that not only validated my suspicion, but stripped away the last plausible deniability my parents could cling to. My mother called me that evening, her voice already quivering with tears before I had said a word, and she accused me of humiliating them, of dragging private matters into public view, of betraying the very people who had raised me. And though part of me wanted to soften, to reassure her, to fall back into the role I had played all my life, I reminded myself of Ethan's face, of the nights I had sat by his bed with bills piled on the counter, of the voicemail telling me to try church, and I told her plainly that a luxury apartment was not an emergency, that the trust had been misused, and that the only humiliation here was the one they had written with their own signatures on wire transfers. My father tried next, not with anger, but with the quiet diplomacy that had been his habit for decades, calling me as though he were the reasonable middleman in someone else's dispute, suggesting that perhaps we could meet privately. Perhaps we could settle this without lawyers, perhaps we could find a way to make it right, without turning it into what he called a spectacle. I listened, because I have always loved my father and still do, but when he finished, I told him with as much gentleness as I could that privacy was a privilege you earn by being honest, and that once dishonesty is documented, privacy is no longer a shield but a curtain hiding a fraud, and that I was done standing in the dark. That weekend, I made preparations of my own. I reserved a private room at a restaurant that had no sentimental connection to our family, no risk of friendly staff who might gossip, no distractions that would allow anyone to pretend it was just another meal. I printed 3 binders, each one organized with tabs, emails, lease pages, bank wires, texts, voicemails, and finally the draft petition itself. I included duplicates, highlighted routing numbers, and even added an explanatory cover page in plain language, because I wanted no one to be able to claim that they did not understand what they were looking at. Brittany, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing had changed, posting pictures from rooftop lounges and captioning them with breezy affirmations, but her messages to me grew sharper, accusing me of overreacting, of making the family look bad, of turning grief into vengeance, and I let the words slide past because the binders on my desk made her protests feel like static compared to the weight of the evidence. Dana reminded me that at the dinner I should not debate feelings, should not allow myself to be drawn into moral comparisons or emotional history lessons, but should present the facts once, clearly and directly, and then offer the choice that had always been theirs: transparency and restitution, or litigation and exposure. She said the documents would speak louder than any tone I could use, and that the less I raised my voice, the sharper the truth would cut. By the time Sunday came, I felt less like a daughter walking into another exhausting family gathering and more like a plaintiff preparing an opening statement, though I kept that thought to myself, because I knew the words would be used against me if spoken aloud. I dressed without ceremony, placed the binders in my bag, and drove to the restaurant with the same steady breathing I had practiced for weeks, reminding myself that this was not revenge for its own sake, but a rebalancing of scales that had been tilted so far for so long that no one even noticed the angle anymore. When I arrived, the manager showed me to the private room, a simple space with a long table and a door that closed firmly, and as I laid the binders at my seat, I saw through the glass wall that Brittany had just walked in, smiling as though nothing in the world could touch her. Her laugh already rising above the host's greeting, and for the first time in years, I did not feel small in her shadow. I felt ready. Because tonight, the paper would speak, and there would be no polite subject changes, no vague assurances, no shifting the spotlight away from the truth. Tonight, they would have to look at what they had done, line by line, and decide what kind of family they really wanted to be when the curtain finally fell. The door to the private room closed with a quiet click that seemed louder to me than the chatter from the rest of the restaurant, and for a moment there was only the strange stillness that comes before something you know cannot be undone. The kind of stillness where everyone is rehearsing their lines in silence and pretending they have not. My parents sat down across from me, my father already fidgeting with the napkin as though it were a shield, my mother holding herself stiff and upright in the chair like she was bracing for a courtroom instead of a family dinner, and Brittany slid in next to them, scrolling on her phone until the very last second, making a show of how little she cared even though the faint tremor in her voice when she ordered water told me she knew exactly what was coming. I told them from the start that I would speak once, that I would lay out the documents in front of me, and then they would be free to respond however they wished. But that this was not going to be another one of those circular family arguments where feelings were the only currency and truth was optional. I reached into my bag and pulled out the binders, placing one in front of each of them with deliberate calm, not tossing or sliding, just setting it down like the weight of the paper carried its own gravity. My mother tried to wave it off, muttering that this wasn't necessary, but I said it was not only necessary, it was overdue. I began with the simplest piece, the text I had sent begging for help when Ethan's treatment was denied, and then my mother's reply that they were tapped out and that maybe the church could step in. I let the silence after I read those words stretch long enough that none of them could pretend they hadn't landed. Then I placed the lease page on top, the one naming the Pierce Family Trust as guarantor, followed by the wire instructions that matched the bank account number on the trust. I explained calmly that while I had been told to pray, the trust had been paying for a rooftop pool and a concierge, and that the same grandparents who wrote the words education and emergencies into the trust document would never have imagined that luxury housing would count while a grandson's treatment did not. Brittany gave a little laugh then, the kind of brittle sound people make when they want to look unbothered, and she said that the apartment wasn't that much, and that I was blowing this out of proportion. I did not even respond with my own words. I simply flipped to the bank statement totals, highlighted line after line of identical wire transfers, and slid it toward her. Her smirk faltered when she saw the numbers stacked in sequence, the total adding up to a sum that could have paid for not only Ethan's treatment but years of additional care. And the quiet gasp that escaped from my father told me he was seeing the total for the first time as well. My mother reached for the old defense, saying I was punishing them for my grief, that I was projecting my pain onto decisions they had made out of love, that I did not understand how fragile Brittany had been and how much they had worried she would fall apart if she did not have stability. I sat there and listened, not interrupting, because Dana had told me that interruptions are gifts to people who thrive on emotional smoke, and when she was done, I said evenly that this was not about punishment, it was about purpose, and that funds marked for emergencies should not be drained to spare one adult the embarrassment of paying her own rent while another child in the same family was denied care. Then I did the part one had rehearsed over and over in my head, the part that made my hands shake the first time I imagined it, but now felt almost mechanical. I told them that they had two options. They could provide a full accounting with supporting documents, issue a written apology acknowledging that the trust had been misused, and agree to redirect future disbursements toward legitimate education or emergency purposes, beginning with a public action in Ethan's name. Or they could refuse, and I would proceed with the petition, which would make all of this part of a public record that any relative, neighbor, or colleague could read. The room shrank then, as if all the air had been pulled out of it, and for a moment no one moved. My father stared at the binder without opening it, my mother's mouth pressed into a thin line, and Brittany finally looked up from the pages she had skimmed only to roll her eyes and declare that this was all unnecessary. Because Grandma had wanted her to have that place. The sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water because it revealed not only her arrogance, but also the comfortable lie she had told herself all these years, one that had been fed by whispered reassurances behind closed doors. A lie so old it had hardened into what she believed was fact. I leaned forward then and placed on the table a copy of the trust letter my grandmother had written, the original words stating that the money existed so that no child in the family would ever be denied an education or care. I pointed to the clause, underlined in black ink, and asked Brittany where in those sentences she saw apartment or lifestyle. She had no answer. She looked at my mother for rescue, but my mother's eyes had flicked down to the page, and for the first time that night, her face betrayed doubt instead of defense. I ended my piece without raising my voice, without a single tear, by sliding one more page across the table, a lease addendum template. I explained that Brittany could assume her own rent next month because the trust would not be covering it again, not by my silence and not by a court's order. I said she was welcome to keep the apartment if she could afford it, but that the days of wiring my grandparents' legacy into her landlord's account were finished. The only sound in the room was the faint clatter of a fork from the restaurant beyond the door, until Brittany broke it with a sharp laugh that tried to mask her panic, and then she leaned back and repeated her claim louder, that Grandma had wanted her to have it, that everyone knew it, that I was rewriting history to make myself feel better. I sat there quietly, letting her words echo against the written proof on the table, and when she finally ran out of air, I simply said, "Then let the documents speak, because they never forget what was written." And at that moment, the fight shifted, because the performance had no audience left to persuade, only the cold permanence of paper, and the realization that the room was no longer hers to control began to show in the tightness around her eyes. It was then that I knew the next step was not theirs to dictate, because for the first time in years, I held the leverage and the story was moving toward an ending they could not spin. The silence that followed Brittany's declaration about Grandma's supposed wishes hung over the table like a heavy curtain, and in that silence I reached once more into my bag and brought out the one document I had saved for the end, because it was the one piece of evidence that neither of them could shout over or twist into a convenient story. It was the original letter my grandmother had written when the trust was established, a copy that Dana had pulled from the official file, yellowed around the edges, but still perfectly clear, and as I unfolded it on the table, I read aloud the exact words she had chosen decades earlier, that the trust existed so no child in this family would ever be denied an education or care. The words were plain, they were specific, and they left no room for interpretation that stretched them into concierge desks, rooftop lounges, or luxury addresses. I watched my father's eyes drop as though the weight of those sentences pressed his head down, and I saw my mother's shoulders stiffen as the flimsy scaffolding of her justifications crumbled beneath the force of our grandmother's handwriting. I let them sit with it for a moment, not because I wanted to hurt them further, but because I needed them to absorb that the truth was bigger than all of us. And then I told them that this was the point where the story could either end in disgrace or pivot into something that carried meaning. I explained that I had already begun the paperwork to establish a memorial grant in Ethan's name at the hospital where I worked, a fund dedicated to covering emergency pediatric costs for families who found themselves caught in the same nightmare I had lived through, where treatment existed but money stood in the way. I told them the seed money for that grant would not be donations from strangers, but restitution from them, in the exact amount that had been drained from the trust to cover Brittany's apartment since the first wire had gone out. It was not a suggestion, it was not a plea, it was the condition on which silence could be preserved and litigation avoided. My mother opened her mouth to protest, but I continued before she could gather momentum, laying out the structure as clearly as possible. The repayment schedule would be drafted that night, signed by both of them, and notarized within the week. If payments were missed, even once, I would proceed with the petition and the public accounting, which would ensure that every dollar, every signature, and every excuse was laid bare in court. I told them they could either write the story themselves, as grandparents who honored their grandson's memory through action, or have it written for them in a docket that would follow their names long after the money was gone. For the first time all evening, My father looked directly at me without flinching, and in his eyes I saw not anger but resignation. The look of a man who finally realized that his lifelong strategy of smoothing over conflicts with quiet half-promises had led him here, to a table where his daughter held the documents, the plan, and the leverage he could no longer deny. He cleared his throat, nodded once, and said they would pay. My mother made a sound between a sigh and a growl, insisting that I was tearing the family apart, but I told her calmly that the family had been fractured long before this dinner, and that all I was doing now was refusing to keep pretending the cracks were invisible. Brittany tried one last time, rolling her eyes and muttering about how this was ridiculous, how it was all just money, how I was making myself sick holding on to bitterness, but I turned to her and said something I had been holding back for years. She was free to keep her apartment if she earned it on her own, but she would never again live on funds meant for emergencies while children in this family suffered, because the illusion of entitlement she had lived under was officially over. She smirked and muttered that I was dramatic, but I saw her glance at the lease addendums still sitting on the table, and the flicker of worry in her eyes told me she understood that this time there would be no bailout waiting quietly in the background. I pulled from my folder one last item, a receipt already stamped from the hospital foundation, showing the first small donation I had made myself to launch the grant. I slid it across the table and told them that their repayment plan would feed directly into that fund, line by line, until the total matched what Brittany's landlord had received over the years. I said the grant would carry Ethan's name, not as a symbol of loss, but as a shield for other children whose parents might not survive the gauntlet of bills and denials alone, and that every month when they wrote their check, they would be reminded of both the cost of their choices and the possibility of redemption if they chose to honor the agreement. I stood then, because there was nothing more to say, and I told them plainly that until the repayment was complete, I was stepping out of the group chats, the family photos, the polite gatherings that gave the illusion of closeness without the substance of it. I said I would not perform family unity while financing dishonesty, and that if they wanted me present in those spaces again, they would have to earn it not with words or gestures, but with proof of follow-through. My mother asked if I would at least keep this private, and I told her I would keep the legal part quiet so long as the payments never missed, but that the apology I requested in writing was not optional, because an unacknowledged wound cannot heal, and this one had festered long enough. When I walked out of that restaurant into the cool night air, I did not feel triumphant or even satisfied in the traditional sense. What I felt was something steadier. A kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop negotiating with people who thrive on ambiguity. I had not shouted, I had not wept, I had not begged, and yet I had secured not only accountability but also a path forward that transformed what had been wasted into something that might save another child's life. In the weeks that followed, the first payment arrived on schedule, accompanied by a terse note from my father and a silence from my mother that said more than any words could. The foundation sent me confirmation that the money had been transferred to the grant, and one morning not long after, I received an email from a social worker at the hospital thanking me for establishing the fund and telling me that the first family had already applied for assistance. I sat at my kitchen table reading that email, and for the first time since Ethan's death, I felt something like breath expanding in my chest without pain. I knew the road ahead would not be smooth, that bitterness and resentment would resurface in texts and calls, that Brittany would find new ways to play the victim, and that my mother would cling to her version of events as long as she lived. But none of that could erase what had been set in motion. The money was moving in the right direction now, the truth had been spoken aloud without being swallowed back down, and the boundary was drawn so clearly that even they could not pretend to miss it. So when people ask me whether I regret it, whether I wish I had let it go for the sake of peace, I tell them the truth. Peace built on lies is not peace, it is theater, and I am finished playing a role that left my son's memory in the wings. I won, not because I destroyed them, but because I reclaimed what was mine to claim, and because I turned their betrayal into something that might keep another mother from hearing the words I once did. And that, to me, is justice enough.